Imagine leaving behind everything you own, everyone who ever hurt you, and everyone who ever loved you, to walk into a wilderness that no wagon has ever crossed. Now imagine doing it not for gold, not for land speculation, but because you believe your life depends on it. In the spring of 1847, a small group of men, women, and children pushed their wagons out of a muddy camp on the Missouri River and turned west, toward a mountain range most of them had never seen and could not even picture. They were heading into the Rockies with no map that told the truth, no guarantee of water, and no idea what waited for them on the other side. What they found at the end of that journey would change the American West forever. But to understand why they left, we have to go back to what they were running from. By early 1847, the people setting out on this trail had already been driven from their homes not once, but several times. They were members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and for over a decade they had been chased from one state to the next. They had been forced out of Missouri under an official order that treated them as enemies of the state. They had built a thriving city in Illinois, only to watch their leader murdered by a mob and their homes burned behind them as they fled across a frozen Mississippi River in the dead of winter. By the time spring came in 1847, thousands of these refugees were camped in tents and dugouts along the Missouri River, in a settlement called winter quarters, sick, exhausted, and burying their dead almost daily. This was not a group of adventurers looking for excitement. This was a population in genuine crisis, searching for the one thing that had been denied them again and again, a place where no one could force them out. To understand how desperate the situation at winter quarters really was, consider this: over the course of that single winter, several hundred people died there, from scurvy, from exposure, from diseases that spread quickly through crowded, poorly insulated shelters made of sod and cottonwood logs. Entire families were wiped out. Graves were dug faster than they could be properly marked. This was the population Brigham Young was drawing his vanguard company from: people who had already buried children, parents, and spouses along the way, people who had every reason to believe that wherever they went next, more of them would die before they got there. And still, when Young called for volunteers to make the first attempt at the crossing, men stepped forward. Their leader, a determined and famously blunt man named Brigham Young, had a plan that sounded almost impossible. He intended to lead an advance company, what would become known as the Vanguard Company, out ahead of the main body of the church, all the way to the Rocky Mountains and beyond, to scout a location so remote and so undesirable to everyone else that his people could finally settle there in peace. He had never seen the destination himself. He was relying on second-hand reports from trappers and explorers, fragments of maps, and a strong personal conviction that somewhere beyond South Pass, in a valley near a great salt lake, there was land nobody else wanted badly enough to fight over. It was, in a very real sense, a gamble on the unknown, staked on the lives of everyone who would follow him. On April 5, 1847, the Vanguard Company began to move out from winter quarters. It was a small, disciplined group, by most counts around 148 people, the vast majority of them men, along with a handful of women and children who came along largely to support the sick and to keep the camp functioning. They brought 72 wagons, a cannon for defense, dozens of horses, mules, oxen, and cows, and enough seed, tools, and provisions to attempt farming a land they had never seen. Every wagon was packed with the accumulated weight of a life being relocated: plows, milk cans, bedding, guns, Bibles, family keepsakes too precious to abandon. And somewhere in that column of wagons was a decision that would define how thousands of others crossed the plains for years afterward. Here is something most people don't know about this journey. The well-worn Oregon Trail already existed on the south side of the Platte River, used for years by fur traders and the first wagon trains headed to Oregon. Brigham Young deliberately chose not to use it. Instead, he ordered his company to travel along the north side of the river, cutting a brand new path through unbroken prairie. Why would anyone add extra difficulty to an already brutal journey? The answer reveals just how much fear and calculation shaped every decision on this trip. Young wanted to avoid conflict with other emigrants, avoid competing for the same grazing land and water sources that thousands of Oregon-bound travelers were already using, and, crucially, keep his people together as a self-contained, defensible unit, cut off from outside interference. That decision to blaze what became known as the Mormon Trail on the north bank of the Platte would go on to guide tens of thousands of pioneers in the years that followed. The early weeks were, by the standards of what was coming, almost gentle. The company moved across what is now Nebraska, following the Platte River westward, watching the landscape slowly transform from tallgrass prairie into a drier, harsher terrain. But even here, danger was constant. Herds of bison sometimes numbering in the thousands crossed their path, and a stampede could destroy a camp in minutes. Rattlesnakes hid in the grass. And there was a subtler danger that the pioneers were only beginning to understand: disease. Cholera, dysentery, and what was then called mountain fever, likely a form of tick-borne illness we would now recognize as Colorado tick fever, could strike a healthy adult in the morning and leave them dead within days. Nobody in 1847 understood germ theory. They didn't know what was making people sick, only that it was sudden, and it was merciless. Life inside that moving column quickly settled into a rigid, almost military rhythm, because discipline was survival. Wagons were organized into groups of 10, each with an appointed captain responsible for order and safety. A bugle sounded each morning at 5 to wake the camp. Prayers were held before the wagons rolled and again before the company settled down for the night. At every stop, the wagons were arranged into a defensive circle, animals corralled inside, guards posted through the night in rotating shifts, because the threat of raids, real or feared, never fully went away. And amid all this discipline, one small, almost charming detail stands out. A member of the company named William Clayton grew frustrated with guessing at distances traveled each day, so he helped design and build one of the earliest odometers ever used on a wagon, a wooden mechanism of wheels and gears attached to a wagon axle that clicked off each mile with mechanical precision. The pioneers called it the roadometer. It sounds like a footnote, but the mileage records it produced became so accurate that later guidebooks for the trail relied directly on Clayton's measurements, helping guide thousands of travelers who came after. By the end of May, the company reached Fort Laramie, in present-day Wyoming, a trading post that served as one of the last reliable waypoints before the truly difficult terrain began. Here they crossed to the south side of the Platte, finally merging briefly with the established Oregon Trail before pressing onward. And it's here that the journey stopped being merely exhausting and started becoming genuinely life-threatening, because ahead of them lay the single most important geographic feature standing between the Missouri River and the Rocky Mountain interior, South Pass. Most people picture crossing the Rocky Mountains as scaling some dramatic, snow-capped peak, the kind of image you'd see in a painting, wagons inching along a knife-edge ridge with a sheer drop on either side. The reality of South Pass is almost the opposite, and that's exactly what made it so valuable. South Pass is a wide, gently sloping saddle across the Continental Divide, so broad and so gradual that many pioneers crossed it without even realizing, at first, that they had just crossed the spine of an entire continent. Water that had been flowing east toward the Mississippi and the Gulf of Mexico was now, on the far side of that invisible line, flowing west toward the Pacific Ocean. It sounds almost anticlimactic. But without this one natural gap in an otherwise nearly impassable mountain wall, the overland migration of the American West as we know it might never have happened at all. Discovering and mapping this route was one of the quiet, underappreciated turning points in American expansion, and by 1847 it was the only realistic corridor a wagon train could use. But crossing South Pass didn't mean the mountains were behind them. It meant the real test was just beginning. And this is where the story of the 1847 journey takes a turn that almost derailed everything. In the last days of June, disaster struck the man who was supposed to be leading this entire expedition. Brigham Young came down with mountain fever. The symptoms were severe: high fever, violent chills, debilitating weakness, the kind of illness that, in the middle of a wilderness with no doctors and no medicine beyond what the pioneers carried themselves, could easily become a death sentence. For days, Young was too sick to sit upright in a wagon seat, forced to lie down as the company continued moving, jolted over uneven ground with every mile. Imagine being the leader who convinced over 100 people to follow you into uncharted mountains on nothing but faith and second-hand rumors of a valley you'd never seen, and then almost dying before you got there. What happens to a company like this if its leader doesn't survive? Nobody in that wagon train had an answer, and for a stretch of days in early July, it was a very real possibility they'd have to find out. During those frightening days, it wasn't only Young who was suffering. Mountain fever tore through the company in waves, striking down other members of the party one after another, so that at times there were more sick people than healthy ones able to drive the teams and stand watch at night. Wagons had to be rearranged so the sickest could lie flat, cushioned as best as possible against a ride that offered no real cushioning at all across rock-strewn ground. There was no way to isolate the sick from the healthy, no understanding yet of how the illness spread, only the grim daily task of checking who had made it through the night and who hadn't. Decisions about the route, the pace, and the eventual destination had to be made by committee in Young's absence, a sobering reminder of just how fragile this entire enterprise really was, resting as it did on the survival of a relatively small handful of leaders in the middle of nowhere. Young did recover, but slowly, and the illness forced a critical decision. As the company reached Fort Bridger, a small mountain outpost run by the famous trapper Jim Bridger, they got their first detailed second-hand descriptions of the land ahead, a great valley near an enormous salt lake, ringed by mountains, with soil that some said was too poor to farm and a climate some claimed was too harsh for crops to survive. It's a striking detail that gets lost in the popular retelling of this story. The very man whose knowledge they relied on, Jim Bridger, reportedly told them he doubted corn could even grow there. For a company betting everything on reaching a farmable refuge, that was not the reassurance they were hoping for. And yet they pressed on anyway, because the alternative, turning back toward a country that had already proven it didn't want them, wasn't really an alternative at all. With Young still recovering, an advance party was sent ahead to find and improve the final and most brutal stretch of the route, a narrow, punishing corridor through the Wasatch Mountains that had only been attempted by wagons once before, the previous year, by the ill-fated Donner Party on their way toward California. That single fact should stop you for a second. The trail the 1847 pioneers were about to follow through the final mountain barrier had been blazed, just 1 year earlier, by the very group whose story would become one of the most infamous tragedies in American history. The 1847 company was walking, quite literally, in the tracks of a catastrophe, hoping their outcome would be different. The route through the Wasatch was a nightmare of narrow canyons, boulder fields, and dense underbrush that had to be hacked away by hand, axe by axe, tree by tree, to widen a path just barely large enough for a wagon to squeeze through. In places, the advance crews had to chop through willow thickets so thick you couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. Wagon wheels had to be lowered down steep, rocky slopes using ropes wrapped around tree trunks as makeshift brakes, one wagon at a time, an agonizingly slow and physically brutal process. Every single one of the 72 wagons had to make this same descent. This wasn't a single dramatic moment of danger. It was days of relentless, grinding labor, performed by people who were already sick, sunburned, and running low on food, with no way of knowing how much farther they had to go. And Brigham Young himself was still recovering, so weak that for the final stretch of the journey he had to be carried in the back of a wagon driven by another member of the company, too ill to even see the moment his people finally broke free of the canyon. On July 21, 1847, an advance scouting party emerged from the mouth of what is now called Emigration Canyon and became the first members of the company to look out over the valley they had traveled over 1,000 miles to reach. Below them stretched a wide, largely treeless basin, ringed by mountains, with a shimmering, otherworldly lake visible in the distance, so salty that almost nothing could live in it. It was not the lush, welcoming paradise some might have hoped for. It was dry, sparse, and by most standards of the time, unimpressive. But it was also, crucially, empty of any other claimants, tucked away in a basin that drained into nowhere, surrounded by mountains that would make it difficult for anyone to easily reach or dislodge them. For a people who had been driven out of every home they'd ever built, difficult to reach wasn't a downside. It was the entire point. 2 days later, on July 23, this advance group began plowing the first furrows into the dry earth, testing whether anything could actually grow there, racing against the calendar to get seeds into the ground before the short growing season closed. And on July 24, 1847, Brigham Young himself, still weak from his illness, was carried out of the mouth of the canyon and finally laid eyes on the valley. According to accounts recorded by those present, he looked out over the basin for a long moment and simply said that this was the right place, and that the company should continue on. That short, unassuming statement, delivered by a man who had nearly died getting there, is why July 24th is still celebrated as Pioneer Day in Utah, more than a century and a half later. It's worth pausing here to ask what success even meant at this point, because the hardest part of this story isn't the arrival, it's what came immediately after. Reaching the valley did not mean safety. It meant the beginning of an entirely new and uncertain fight for survival, in a place nobody was even sure could sustain a crop. The pioneers had made it across the plains, across South Pass, through mountain fever and near catastrophe in the Wasatch Canyons, only to arrive at a destination that offered no guarantees whatsoever. The soil was hard and dry. Water had to be diverted from mountain streams through hand-dug irrigation ditches, a technique of large-scale irrigated farming that was almost unheard of among American settlers at the time, but which this community would pioneer out of sheer necessity, developing methods that would later spread across the arid American West. Within weeks, crickets, likely a native species now known as the Mormon cricket in reference to this very event, descended on the fragile new crops in devastating swarms. According to later church accounts, the fields were saved that first difficult season only when huge flocks of gulls arrived and devoured the insects, an event still commemorated in Utah as the miracle of the gulls, whatever explanation one gives for exactly why it happened. Brigham Young did not stay in the valley for long that first season. Almost as soon as the initial planting was underway, he turned around and led a portion of the company back east, retracing that same brutal trail through the Wasatch Canyons, back across South Pass, back across the plains, to bring the news to the thousands of people still waiting at winter quarters and to organize the far larger migration that would follow over the coming years. Think about that for a moment. After nearly dying of fever, after weeks of hauling wagons down mountain slopes by rope, after finally reaching a valley he had staked everything on, his response was not to rest. It was to turn around and do the entire brutal journey again, so that everyone left behind could follow. The company that had made this first crossing didn't simply vanish into history once the valley was settled. Many of the same men who had hauled wagons down the Wasatch Canyons by rope were sent back out again and again in the following years, this time as guides, rescuers, and trail improvers, meeting incoming companies partway, bringing fresh oxen and food to travelers who had underestimated the journey. The trail itself was continually widened and improved with each passing season, ferries were established at the worst river crossings, and way stations were built to offer some measure of relief to those who followed. In a strange way, the hardship of that first 1847 crossing became the very thing that made every subsequent crossing at least somewhat less deadly, because the people who suffered through it made it their mission to spare others the worst of what they had endured. And follow they did. Over the next 2 decades, an estimated 70,000 people would make this same overland trek along the trail the 1847 Vanguard Company had blazed, on foot, in wagons, and later, remarkably, pulling their belongings in simple 2-wheeled handcarts when wagons and draft animals became too scarce and too expensive for many later companies to afford. Some of those handcart companies, setting out too late in the season in the 1850s, would be caught by early winter storms in the very same mountains, resulting in some of the deadliest disasters in the entire history of American westward migration. The trail that began in 1847 as one small, desperate gamble became, over the following decades, a route walked by tens of thousands, not all of whom survived to see the valley at the end of it. What the 1847 Vanguard Company actually accomplished, when you step back from the day-to-day suffering of the journey, is difficult to overstate. They didn't just survive a crossing of the Rocky Mountains. They permanently mapped and improved a viable wagon route through some of the most difficult terrain in the American West, a route that would go on to be used by the Pony Express, by transcontinental telegraph lines, and eventually by portions of the very railroad that connected the country coast to coast just over 20 years later. They established, from nothing, in a valley that an experienced mountain man told them couldn't grow corn, one of the most successful large-scale settlements in the history of American westward expansion, using irrigation techniques that would go on to transform farming across the entire arid West. And they did it not chasing gold, or free land for speculation, or adventure, but simply trying to find one place on the map where they wouldn't be forced to run again. It's easy, looking back from where we sit now, to reduce this story to a single triumphant sentence: they crossed the Rockies and built a city in the desert. But that sentence erases the fever that nearly killed their leader before he ever saw the valley he was risking everyone's lives for. It erases the days spent lowering wagons down mountainsides by rope, one at a time, through canyons first cut open by a doomed expedition the year before. It erases the very real possibility, sitting somewhere in early July of 1847, that this entire journey could have ended in failure and death, the same way it so nearly did for the group that blazed the trail just ahead of them. What actually happened, against fairly steep odds, was that a group of refugees turned a punishing, unmapped mountain crossing into the foundation of a permanent home, and in doing so, opened a route that would carry tens of thousands of others behind them. If you had been standing in that wagon train in the spring of 1847, sick, uncertain, and following a leader who himself had never seen the destination, would you have kept going, or would fear of the unknown have turned you back?